Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz guitarist Aaron Strossner. We caught up with him during the beginning of the COVID-19 quarantine world of March 2020. We spoke about this new jazz world we are in, his latest 2020 CD Haymarket Station. These days he is in Lincoln, Nebraska, and is both a professor and musician. So please get to know him and dig this interview. Man, so how you guys holding up over there?
It's real slow to come here. I mean, there are only a couple cases in the city. Sometimes I kind of think, though, like, you know, we're totally hunkered down already, and there are hardly any cases here. It kind of almost makes me think you'd almost maybe rather be in an area where you're a little bit further along on this thing, right? I mean, maybe in New York City it'll all be over in 6 weeks, but maybe here it'll last another 3 months or something, you know, because we're just waiting and waiting and waiting for it to kind of come, you know. It's almost the waiting is the hardest part.
Well, but that's the thing that I'm trying to figure out right now. It's like there's all this talk about the numbers spiking. I mean, Kansas City's doing the same thing. I mean, we've been hunkered down for 2.5 weeks now. I mean, we had a serious order a week ago where no one could leave, and when I'm driving around, no one's out. No one's doing. So I'm wondering if we're all really like holding true to all of this. What if the numbers don't go anywhere? I mean, I was talking to a guy at the pharmacy a couple of weeks ago that said that if New York did what we're doing 2 or 3 weeks before, they wouldn't be where they're at right now. So maybe because your numbers are low and our numbers aren't going up, maybe that's just going to be a part of the process. We're ending it, you know? I mean, it's that's my hope, because I can't imagine the mental health of this country if this thing staggers on for some unbelievable amount of time.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
But at any rate, I was hoping with these interviews it'd be a good way to get kind of an oasis away from everything. So thanks for taking a minute to talk with Neon Jazz today. I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
So let's talk about Haymarket Station. Talk to me a little bit about what your vision for this project was.
Well, several of these songs I'd written while I was a graduate student here at the University of Nebraska. Strangely enough, so I'm getting another call I'm just gonna ignore. Strangely enough, Nebraska is awarding DMA, Doctor of Music degrees in jazz studies. So kind of what it seems as though what they do then is they kind of bring these older, more experienced players in to play in their big band and all that, and to get their degrees here. And it was a good experience for me. Again, probably what really kind of was the meat and potatoes of my work while I was here was playing in the school's big band. And I really hadn't had a lot of experience with big band. So that was a different challenge for me. I had to work on my reading skills a lot. But in the meanwhile, then I had to do recitals every semester. Now, I'm an old reformed singer-songwriter. I used to have this rock band in New York. And so, you know, I think a lot of my writing kind of reflects some of that stuff. Now, if you go back and listen to the rock music I was writing in the late 90s and the early 2000s, in the context of a rock band, it's like, fairly sophisticated kind of hip stuff. But here now moving into instrumental composition, I kind of, didn't really know how comfortable I was going to be with that. And of course, kind of always had this feeling as though I need to kind of break out of, a lot of these kind of songwriting trends and cliches, maybe even that I had fallen into. But as I was working in these recitals then as a student, my advisor here at the university had suggested, hey, I'd like to see more arranging of these songs. I started doing some standards, and he always wanted me to write a new intro to this or a new outro or to do something else, to change the arrangement of the song. And I just kind of thought to myself, if I'm really going to be writing stuff like that, then let's just scrap the standard and just try and write my own stuff. So a lot of these songs on Haymarket Station really kind of actually first appeared in some recitals that I was doing. But again, when you're in the middle of school, there's just a million things that you're trying to do at once. And so while I got the material together to perform it for a recital, I never really felt as though I had lived with it long enough. So that process didn't really happen until I got out of school, and then I thought to myself, hey, I'm slowly acquiring a whole new catalog now of instrumental music. so that all kind of started to pop out in Haymarket Station. A couple of the songs were very recently written, just in the last year or two, but several of them have been kind of kicking around for a couple of years. I just never really felt like I had enough time to perform them. And the band also all have connections to the University of Nebraska. Andrew Ray, I don't know if you noticed the drummer, he is from Kansas City, a young guy, really, I think he's 19 years old, but incredible drummer, fantastic to play with him. And Mitch Benson, the bass player as well, I met him in a class at the University of Nebraska. The only one who didn't, I guess, Kevin Lloyd, my keyboard player, but he grew up in Lincoln and lives in Omaha now. As soon as I met him and really kind of checked out what he was doing, I just thought to myself that he would be perfect for the project.
Right on. So talk to me about where you were born and raised.
I was born in Monroe, Wisconsin. Small town boy. I had kind of an extended family growing up. My parents were remarried, and so sometimes in that kind of extended family situation, I suddenly acquired these stepbrothers who were several years older than I, like a decade older than I. And then so as I was like in grade school and in junior high and everything, hey, I knew these guys who lived in Milwaukee, which was like the big city to me. And these guys were telling me all the new music to check out. Now, this was like back in the 80s. So the new music to check out was pretty much like hard rock and guitar rock and everything kind of post Van Halen. But I was like the kid in school who always knew like the hippest new bands, I mean, people were like discovering Motley Crue, and I was like, no, man, you got to check out this UFO, or you got to check out Uli Jan Roth, or, all these kind of obscure, like European rock guitar players. But I was very much then kind of a rock fan at that age. And when I was in high school, I too would say, wow, Eddie Van Halen was really, the moment I heard that stuff, I just thought, wow, that's great. That's great stuff. Loved it. The crossroads kind of happened pretty quickly, as it seemed as though the whole world kind of went nuts for that kind of playing. And then, but right away, it didn't really seem as though anybody was writing songs like they used to be able to write. Those early Van Halen records, I thought that those songs were really great and really clever. And I, the metal shredding and the kind of technique and everything that followed all that stuff really kind of left me feeling very empty. Then I remember also in high school, I remember one particular year being dazzled at the same moment with the brand new Yngwie Malmsteen record, who kind of appeared out of nowhere, right around the same time that Stevie Ray Vaughan, Couldn't Stand the Weather, had come out. And I loved them both. I was impressed with both of them, and I just kind of realized, though, that, like, wow, my whole world is kind of fracturing into all these different kind of stylistic things, and I wasn't really sure, where I was going to go, because I really kind of believed in both of those guys and what they were doing. But again, while I was a big fan of those sorts of things, I oftentimes wasn't really a fan of the generation that followed. It seemed maybe kind of a hollow imitation of that kind of thing. And usually I always felt as though, well, it seems like while you may be able to mimic the way these guys play, I didn't hear a lot of people kind of writing songs that were as interesting as the stuff that they were writing. Then when I got into college, then I fell in love I went to Madison, Wisconsin for a couple of years, and I fell in love with a local guitar player named Paul Black, a slide player. He was from the Delta, and he was played with a group that's called Paul Black and the Flip Kings. Well, man, he was great. He's fantastic, and years later he came out with a recording that came out on the House of Blues label. But at the time, it was pretty well known that Paul, for whatever reason, he was a Madison artist, and he didn't really travel a whole hell of a lot. But I remember when I first started to see him live again, jaw-dropping, just thought, wow, this is the real deal. And, years and years and years later, I still go back and think, like, man, he was the real deal, and I really should have checked him out more. Of course, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, it would be terrible to say this, but I believe that he is no longer with us. I know that his health had been failing for quite a while. So he was a very, again, an inspirational figure, and I had begun to attend school in Madison, Wisconsin, really without a major. Didn't know what I was going to study. I was kind of dabbling in all these different things, but meanwhile, I was playing a lot of guitar, and it all kind of started to coalesce. I started to ask myself, like, man, I'm looking for a major here in college, and I'm spending all my time playing guitar at home. So I started taking lessons. Really, to tell you the truth, some of the first guitar lessons I really took, I mean, in high school when I was playing, it was all just really by ear. I was just kind of copying everything that I bought and records that I'd play, and I learned the ubiquitous power chord, and like suddenly I could play the rhythm tracks of everything. I didn't know what anybody was doing when they took a solo, but I got a good ear as far as like figuring out how to figure out their rhythm parts, and I started taking lessons with a guy in Madison who went to Berklee School of Music in Boston. And I started to think, like, hey, I guess I need a change. Madison did not have really kind of any kind of contemporary music program. They didn't have any guitar instructor who was doing anything other than strictly classical. And I kind of feared that would be a little bit out of my reach. So somehow this very, very green guitarist wound up going to Berklee in Boston. In fact, Berklee, they only admitted me to a summer program, and they said, well, why don't you come to the summer and we'll see how you do, and maybe if you do okay, we'll accept you in the fall. And so I went, though, and I did well enough. I actually tested kind of highly into some classes and some of that work, and so staying in the fall wasn't such a big thing. But boy, those early years at Berklee, I really fell amongst really some of the top guys, in the world who are playing right now. It was a very fertile year. This is the late 80s at Berklee, and I had a roommate who was a very accomplished player, and then so I met all these guys would come over to our apartment and jam and all this stuff. And I mean, a lot of these guys I couldn't even really play with, but I would sit and listen. I would sit and listen and wonder when Mark Turner came over, or when Peter Bernstein came over, or when Bill McHenry came over, any one of a number of guys. I remember one of my first classes, I had Chris Cheek was in my class, sax player. I mean, there were really guys all over the place, and it was very, again, inspirational for me. I was not at all on anybody's level, but again, it was kind of a humbling process that took place kind of really right then and there. And, I had never been particularly drawn to jazz. I guess I didn't really understand it much as a younger listener. But, once I, kind of started to really realize again, how the form is always repeating. And suddenly I think all it really is for a lot of listeners, maybe people who don't understand it, they don't maybe really kind of understand that whole concept of form, and how, if you're hearing a song that you like, if you can just sing the melody to that song, you can sing that melody over and over and over through all those big long solos, and 20 minutes into the song, if you can still hear that melody, suddenly you don't feel lost anymore. Suddenly everything takes shape, and everything has form, and everything makes sense. And all that stuff had to kind of happen to me already. I was in my late teens before I really kind of started to get it. But again, once I got it and, saw some of these really incredible players, I'm almost relieved now as a couple decades have gone on to see that some of those guys who I was around really did turn out to be really some of the most impressive players of our generation. I was thinking, as a freshman at Berklee, or as a sophomore, or whatever I was thinking, like, wow, these guys seem really, really good. And again, it almost gave me comfort to kind of realize a few years later, like, yeah, they really are that good. And, I was just very lucky to be around them.
Tell me, what was the first live jazz show you ever saw that really blew your doors down?
I would probably say a Berklee recital with Kurt Rosenwinkel Kurt was pretty much making everybody's jaw drop, and Kurt's just a couple years younger than I am. I think he showed up there and he was around 17 years old, and I tell you, jaws dropped. I mean, everybody who was around this guy, it was just, electricity in the air. And I remember, I'll tell this little story. It's funny because years later, George Garzone told me a very similar experience happened to him. Again, my roommate at Berkeley was friends with Kurt, and Kurt was an acquaintance. But again, I had no business, playing with him. Was literally just years and years and years away from getting to that sort of level. And I remember Kurt did a recital, and a couple of us guitar players were walking out with him afterwards, and he said, "Hey, why don't you guys come on over and we'll jam?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, what am I gonna do? Just sit there and watch you?" And I almost had tears in my eyes. I mean, I realized, wow, I would so love to jam with you, but I mean, I can't jam with you. And I just felt really kind of awkward about the whole thing. And I never did go to his house on that day. I just was like, I had that little moment where a realization over how badly I wanted to go where he was, but also at the same point realizing, man, I got nothing to share with this guy. I mean, I can't even pick up an instrument and make music with you. Not here and now. So, with tears in my eyes, I went home and, probably practiced all night and all that stuff. But yeah, there's some really funny moments where it was kind of like, man, you kind of had to hit the ground running. And it was just kind of almost a slap in the face in a lot of ways. A lot of the guys at Berkeley around that time in the late 80s, there were a lot of guys who were really out too, just playing really out music, even in recitals and all this stuff. I don't know if you've heard of an alto player named Jim Hobbs, and for a while he ran this band in Boston called the Fully Celebrated Orchestra. And these guys would do these recitals, and it would just be so messed up, what they were doing. I mean, especially to a novice like myself, and I would just sit there and I'd ask myself, you guys seem to know how to play your instruments, so why are you choosing to play such messed up stuff, The kind of feeling where these recitals were overwhelming for their bizarreness and strangeness, and being so overwhelmed that it's sometimes, I'd leave early not because I was troubled by it, but it was just man, I have to digest what's going on here, I mean, this recital is going to last an hour and a half, and maybe 45 minutes I would just have to leave, because I was just, swarming in my head with all the emotion and all the, trying to reorganize or recap what I had just seen. Those were real strange moments. But, I'm glad that I had those sorts of experiences early, because, again, even then within about 5 years, I was living in New York, and I started working at the old Original Knitting Factory label, and I kind of walked in there thinking to myself, hey, man, I've seen it all. There's nothing here at the Knitting Factory that's really going to shock me anymore. And, that's kind of a nice feeling to kind of have early on. I'm not saying that I'm playing this way or playing that way myself personally, but even just kind of as a listener, I've been exposed to this now and exposed to that sort of thing, and it kind of gave me a little bit of confidence moving on.
I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit here and ask you, and the music has been silenced. There's no live jazz now or music, and I want to know what do you think? What do you hope is the revelation that people have when they actually get back out and see music again? What do you hope the fan gets, and how they respond when it comes back?
I've always kind of noticed that people. Again, I guess when I consider audiences in general, again, these are big generalizations. It seems to me that a jazz audience is much more willing to listen to things that are outside of their scope, when it's live. If it's live, you can watch a totally avant-garde, bizarre kind of, show, but you're there live, and so you're seeing the faces, and you're following the action from this player to this player to this player to this player, and you can be very engaged. And I think that when you're home and you're hearing that on your Spotify or what have you, it's just so much easier to just flip the dial, or to just say like, I don't know what this is, and not be drawn in. So I keep saying this, and I keep hoping this, that as the years go on, obviously live performance, and especially in the jazz world, it seems to be less and less profitable, and less people are going out to see things. But I just keep hoping that eventually it'll like have thinned out to such a great extent that maybe kind of will turn around and say, wow, this was really special, and this is really unique, and to really appreciate the power of live performance. And again, its ability to draw you into listening to things that, too conveniently you might not really engage yourself, as a listener when you're sitting at home. So, I guess that's what I really hope, is that, again, maybe there'll be some sort of a rebirth, and again, a realization that, wow, if I'm really in the same room as this, and I'm listening and I'm seeing it live, there's just so many more lessons to be drawn, listening to people play. I say this to my young guitar students as well. I kind of chastise them when I never see them around town. I'm like, hey, how come you never go out? I never see you listening to stuff. And again, they can say, I've been listening to this Wes Montgomery, and, I'm like, well, that's great, but like, to go there and sit in a venue and to watch the guy, that's a whole other experience. There's just so much more to be drawn from that. Or, for instance, I'll tell people kind of the story about how, a lot of times you'll go to a jazz concert or performance, and hey, certain instrumentalists will kind of be all over their instrument, like have all this technique, and then there might be other players up on stage who don't really kind of seem to have all that kind of technical command. But the real interesting moment is when the person with less technique and less command, though, makes you smile. Like there's some kind of intelligence there, or some sort of humor there, or something that's reaching out to you, that, again, this person standing next to them is like blowing and blowing and blowing and blowing, and you're just kind of thinking like, it's not really doing much for me. So I say to my students, like, man, those are really important moments. It's not all more is more. It's more about, a human touch and a human feeling and a communication with your audience. And, does your audience understand your perspective or your humor or any of those other things? These are all things that just seem to me to be so much more evident when you see live performance. And again, you're just not drawn into it in the same way when you're listening at home.
Hey, thank you for taking some time out to talk about the new album, what's going on in our world, and hopefully getting back to live music and everything in between. I really appreciate your time today.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in Nebraska, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Aaron for his time and his music. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, please support the arts, all of them, including jazz, and enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.